Hello, everyone, and welcome to week five. This is Crisis of the European Global Order, 1914 to 1991. So we're going from the First World War, which, of course, we see here in this picture, was not known as the First World War until World War II, all the way up to the Cold War. So we're covering a huge amount of material this week, and it's going to be, I would say, probably the most intense week so far in this class. There's only one more week left after this, which is pretty astounding. But I wanted to remind you that the comparative review essay, which is a fancy way of saying your 5-page paper, which is worth 25% of your final grade, is due in this coming Friday, the end of June 17th. So June 17th at midnight is the deadline for your papers. Now, these are not immediately available, but these will be available at 9 o'clock on Sunday, June 12th. So you have less than a week to write a comparative review essay. Now, just a quick heads up what I mean by comparative review essay. You're going to be selecting two different historical sources written by historians, but addressing a common theme. So it might be the First World War. It might be Columbus's voyages. It could be anything from 1500 or even the beginning of this class period all the way up to the present day. And what you're going to do is to think critically about those sources, particularly in the way that a historian reads a secondary source. So you're looking at the arguments that are being constructed by the historians, the way in which the topic is treated perhaps differently, using argument and using different kinds of evidence. You'll think about how clearly do these scholars identify, do they signpost their evidence, use citation, and so on. So there will be plenty of instructions to go along with this assignment. This is actually listed on your module page as module 0, rather confusingly. So it's not on module 5, it's module 0, but what that basically means is the essay which is due. And again, you really need to turn this in because this is worth 25% of your final grade. So, moving on. The goals for this week's class, we're going to be explaining the concept of a crisis in the European global order. I think reading the material for last week, we would have really come to terms with this idea of a European global order based on the scientific industrial revolutions, the spread of global imperialism. And of course, you can see this very clearly in this map that Strayer provides of the world at the beginning of the 20th century, where you see the huge influence of European empires over Africa and Asia in particular. So these are the kind of new imperial empires of the Industrial Revolution. Probably really the only two traditional empires that we're looking at are the Russians and the Chinese, who have been around for hundreds and thousands of years respectively. So the first thing is to explain the concept of a crisis in the European global order between obviously the First and Second World Wars. So what does that actually amount to? And what comes afterwards? So really you're seeing the century of European dominance being replaced by a bipolar power struggle, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and eventually what historians have come to refer to as the American century, which was the 20th century. Another thing we're going to look at this week is comparing and contrasting the efforts in the wake of the First and Second World War to rebuild the peace, to create a lasting peace among the Allies. Now, obviously, the outcomes in World War I and World War II were very different. World War I, you have the devastation of Europe and much of the rest of the world. And a period of economic prosperity in some parts of the world, like in America, you have the Roaring Twenties, which is brought to a grinding halt by the Great Wall Street crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s. And other parts of the world, particularly Germany, which had been defeated in the First World War, really had, from the get-go, complete economic and cultural devastation. And this is where you see the rise of political extremism, particularly in the 1930s with Adolf Hitler, and even slightly before that with the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union. So describing the appeal of these radical ideologies like fascism and communism. This is something that I think is a really interesting exercise as historians, because you're actually trying to think not just these were the bad guys, but there was something about the message of the Bolsheviks in Tsarist Russia during 1917, or Adolf Hitler in Germany in 1933, that actually appealed to significant numbers of people. We're talking about millions of people here who are buying into these radical extremist messages. And what is it at that particular time and place that's appealing about those messages? And then, of course, you go from the Second World War to the final period of the 20th century, really, which is the Cold War, which I'm actually old enough to remember, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but this is, again, something that we're going to look at and try and identify the major milestones. So for this week's discussion forum, this is another point I wanted to make before I finish. I wanted to open up the topic a little bit more than usual. So rather than give you a specific prompt, I've posted a list of questions, and we're covering so much material in this textbook this week that it's a little bit overwhelming. So I thought instead it would be nice to use the videos to get the ball rolling, so you can come up with your own questions or respond to the questions on the discussion forum. And also, this is another way for me to see who's actually watching these videos. Finally, I wanted to point out that there is an extra credit of 5 points here as a reward for listening to the end of this video. I know you've listened to my talking into my laptop for the last 6.5 minutes, so I thought I'd give you a little bit of an incentive. So when I teach in the classroom world history, I'll often ask my students, how many people can tell me why America entered the Second World War in December of 1941? And usually I see a sea of hands, because I think most people either know or they don't want me to think that they don't know that this was a response to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which led to American entry into World War II. But when I ask the same question about World War I, I often get some blank responses. So again, this is just a little bit of extra credit, a little bit of incentive for listening to this video, and also to see who's actually listening. So if you email me at smithmd6 miamio.edu, just briefly, one sentence answer: why did America enter the First World War? And I'll see to it that you get 5 extra credit points. Okay, thanks very much, folks, and enjoy writing your papers. I will enjoy reading them at the end of this week. Thanks very much. Bye.